At the end of every course at UCSB, students are asked to evaluate their instructor and course by way of 2 multiple-choice questions on a computer form. The English department adds a second evaluation, as we also invite students to add a written comment. Unfortunately, the first time this course was offered, the coronavirus forced us to cancel the last classes of the term when these evaluations would have taken place. Of course, given all the horrible hardships that came with this virus, this was a pretty darn insignificant consequence in the big scheme of things. Still, I miss not knowing what students thought of this course, as it was the first time that it's ever been taught, and it was experimental in a variety of ways. While thinking about it, it soon occurred to me that it would be in fact fitting if students were invited to provide their feedback in the same way that they commented on the course material itself, publicly, on YouTube. I especially like this idea because UCSB does not make its evaluations public. Although I make a point of eventually getting around to publishing all of this student feedback to my personal website, having this feedback anthologized with the other comments just makes a lot of sense. One of the things that's always annoyed me about UCSB's policy is that, in not publicly making these evaluations, the only person who benefits by them is the instructor. This is unfortunate, as it seems to me that this feedback would potentially be helpful to students trying to decide whether they wanted to take this course or not. So I resolved to put together this little video as an invitation to anyone who has taken the course from the first year onward to let me, as well as the rest of the students in the class, and in fact anyone visiting this YouTube channel, such as prospective students in the future, to know what you thought of the class. One shortcoming of this approach is that these comments are not necessarily anonymous, as are the official UCSB evaluations, as students have generally been using their real names on YouTube. Nonetheless, if you would like to retain your anonymity, please feel free to make a comment using an alternate screen name. Still, posting this comment here is entirely optional on your part. As with all the other issues that we've encountered this term, I'm interested to hear what you thought about the course. What worked, what didn't, what was important, what wasn't, and so forth. I sincerely would love to hear what you have to say. Let me also take this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, starting with the YouTube comments on the course material. This will also give me a chance to unpack some of the course's underlying rationale. The extensive YouTube comments were, as far as I was concerned, a wonderful delight, and in many respects the most important part of this course. They also form the basis of the deep dive lectures, which I have concluded could be improved upon, and I'll talk more about this later. So, if you did not take the UCSB course, allow me to briefly quote from the course website in order to explain how these deep dive videos worked. So, this course employs an admittedly experimental variation on the now traditional approach of flipping a classroom. Prior to class, students will have watched or read the day's material and comment on it, as well as, and this is important, commented on what their classmates had to say as well. All commenting will be done on YouTube and hence will be completely public. During the class sessions, and these are the deep dive lectures, Ken will jump into this discussion by reflecting on particularly helpful comments which he will be posting on screen. As I explained in some detail on the course website, my goal with the comments was to create a discussion-based course involving over 800 students. Many people are of the decided opinion that the best size for a discussion class is just the opposite of this approach. Classes that are as small as possible, indeed around 1/100th the size of this course, as the ideal for many is a seminar with 8 to 12 students. Indeed, this is pretty conventional wisdom. Having taught at both Harvard and Princeton, I'm very familiar with discussion classes of this size, having led quite a few of them, which are the norm at both of these schools, as well as a broad range of private. And by that I mean, read expensive and sometimes elitist colleges. However, looking back on the experience of the past 10 weeks, I can say with complete confidence that these online UCSB discussions surpassed, by orders of magnitude, any discussion that I ever led at Harvard or Princeton. By that, I'm not just talking about the sheer number of comments or words written. In terms of metrics like these, few courses on the planet could compete with what happened with English 23, as the students in this class together literally wrote millions of words of commentary and discussion. No, I'm talking about the quality of these discussions, not quantity. First, the comments and questions posed by students were generally far longer and more thoughtful than one might say off the cuff, in real time, during a conventional discussion. This is one of the great advantages of switching to discussions using the written rather than the spoken word. So, in addition to being a cultural historian, I am also a literature professor. Hence, as the written word is my stock in trade, I know that it can in many ways surpass spoken speech. While Oscar Wilde may have been as clever as some of his characters when he spoke, few conversations are as witty as those that he penned. When we put pen to paper, or fingers to keyboard, we have an advantage of time. Time to reflect on what we're going to express, time to craft our individual sentences and phrases, time to go back and revise what we've written, and even if we take just a little time, a minute or two, this still gives us some time for thought. Written comments have additional advantages. Even if there are just 10 people in the room, speaking up in class can be a daunting experience. For some people, more daunting than others. In fact, for some, so daunting that they never express what they're thinking to everyone else. I remember my first seminar in college. I didn't say a single word the entire term. In fact, I didn't say a single word my second seminar either. As a professor, I have led plenty of small seminars where some people never talked, and others where more than half the class had little to say. But by making comments a requirement of the course and removing any face-to-face social pressure, it means that everyone gets to be heard, and we all benefit by that. With public comments like these, we also have the opportunity to read what others have written prior to putting our own 2 cents in. This is where comments turn into discussions as people get to respond not only to the course material, but to each other. And what interesting comments and discussions we had in this course. Really were quite remarkable. To be honest, they greatly exceeded my expectations. People said more interesting things than I ever imagined. I'm sure some of this had to do with the subject matter, the climate crisis. Many of my students and people of their generation, and let's face it, people everywhere, are rightly very concerned about this crisis, which is no longer a hypothetical, but has now arrived. The great diversity of this class was also a factor, a wonderful factor, as we had students from around the world in a range of different backgrounds sharing unique perspectives on the course material. I will always remember one of the comments toward the end of this course, which began, quote, "When I was reading Being the Change, I couldn't help but think of my parents. They were recently deported to Mexico." All this drew more than just my attention, as people responded, often in droves, to comments by their classmates that were particularly interesting and resonated with them. The above comment received over 70 responses, for example. As you can probably tell, I am more than a little psyched about the comments in this course. But my enthusiasm may have been a bit of a problem. Because I found the comments so interesting, compelling, I completely structured the in-class lectures around them. The idea was to have a discussion not unlike what would have happened in a traditional seminar involving a dozen or fewer students. In a traditional seminar of this sort, everyone comes to class having read or watched the course material. I would usually begin by making an opening statement, which, depending on the material, would take a few minutes. After which, people in the class would offer their thoughts on the material and questions that I had raised. These comments would then often elicit responses from other people in the room. During this time, incidentally, I usually try to hang back until everyone has had a chance to respond to their classmate. Once they have, I would then weigh in myself, delivering new information in the process. This procedure would repeat itself again and again throughout the session. I have to admit that I very much like this seminar model, as it allows students in the room to structure how I present the material and my thoughts to them. In other words, if people are interested in a particular issue, I can then teach them more about that issue. In a lecture, by contrast, I am solely deciding what is important and the order in which it appears, leaving students out of the process altogether. Even though traditional seminars and lectures introduce students to a range of new materials and ideas, the seminar approach has the potential to be far more effective and ultimately more personally meaningful as it tailors instructions to students in the class. This has long been a selling point of colleges, often expensive little ones, which promise small classes, which is central to their pedagogical approach. Although I was inspired by this seminar model, my suspicion was that it could work even better if far far more people than a handful were involved. So in this course, I posted my short opening statement to YouTube and then invited comments on it, as well as responses to those comments. As with the small face-to-face seminar, I then replied to some of the most interesting of these comments and responses one by one. This was done during the class period as I projected selected comments on screen for the whole class to read while I weighed in. What quickly became apparent, and this was fascinating, was that students were essentially voting on what they found interesting by replying to comments that focused on particular issues. This often made it easy for me to decide which comments to discuss in class, as those receiving dozens of responses were clearly resonating with people. Although something similar can happen in a small lecture when people latch on to a comment, in this case such enthusiasm was made especially clear. This is not to say that the only interesting comments were those that received dozens of responses. In fact, one of the real challenges of preparing for class period was choosing which comments and responses to project on screen, as there were often 100 or more really interesting ones. While I was more than a little pleased with how all this worked out, it also occurred to me that the in-class experience may have been different for different people. While some students might have been, like me, intrigued by what their classmates had to say about the issue at hand, others may have found spending the entire class staring at large chunks of text more than a little tedious. At different points throughout the term, I suspect that many people probably felt both ways. Students in the first iteration of this class may remember that toward the end of the term, I somewhat surprisingly announced that I would be teaching an honors seminar the following quarter. My reason for doing so was to address this particular issue. The object of that small seminar is to have students scour the internet for short-form videos, and by that I mean, 3 to 5 minute long videos that can help teach or add something to the weekly in-class discussion. For example, in one of my classes, I played a short video on the tragedy of the commons that was produced by TED-Ed. That's the education end of the TED project. It was wonderful and wonderfully short and a key way of introducing this concept. Of course, I could have simply talked about the tragedy of the commons for 5 minutes, but it occurs to me that interspersing video material like this throughout the class period may well be more interesting and make things more varied. Hence, the goal of this new seminar is to create a library of short-form videos of this sort, as there will simply be too much to show during the class period. And there will be links to a range of this material on the course website. Anyhow, those were a few of my reflections on the course and one way that I think that it could be improved. Now, I would like very much to hear your thoughts on the course.